President-elect Biden promises to turn away from Donald Trump's America First policies and once again embrace U.S. allies. But just how different will American foreign policy be under this new administration? Joining us now, former CIA Director John Brennan, author of the new book, Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. Director Brennan, you said recently that if Israel was behind the assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist, and that seems likely, that it would be a case of state-sponsored terrorism. Now, Iran has no qualms about going after and killing American officials, American soldiers. So why is it off limits to go after the scientist or General Soleimani?
Well, Chris, we condemn Iran when it engages in such activity. And I think there are certain norms and standards of international behavior by sovereign states that should be adhered to, and assassinations should be condemned. If China were to assassinate a Taiwanese nuclear scientist, or if Russia were to assassinate a Ukrainian nuclear scientist, it would be roundly condemned, and rightly so. And just because it may have been Israel behind assassination does not make it right. I do think it is not consistent with those norms of international behavior that sovereign states should abide by.
But, I mean, you certainly would agree that Iran is not Taiwan or Ukraine. I mean, they're a bad actor in the world. Do these Marquess of Queensberry rules apply to them?
Well, I agree, Chris, that there are many Iranians who are extremist, radical, and violent. But Iran is not a monolith. It is a sovereign state. It does have a seat at the United Nations. And therefore, again, I don't think a sovereign state should kill the senior officials of another government because they can or because they want to. If that were the case, I think the international environment would be rather chaotic.
In your new book, Undaunted, you say that the Iran nuclear deal was one of the crown jewels of the Obama administration, which I'm sure will give heartburn to people in the Trump administration. If Joe Biden renegotiates a deal with Iran, as he says he intends to, doesn't he have to almost start from scratch? I mean, there are some sunset provisions in the Iran nuclear deal that have already lapsed and some that are going to lapse within 5 years. Doesn't he almost have to start from scratch?
Well, I don't think he has to start from scratch because a lot has been done as a result of that joint comprehensive plan of action, the Iranian nuclear deal. The Iranians did destroy a number of their centrifuges. They did reduce the amount of heavy water that they had. But I agree that there needs to be a return to discussions in order to determine what Iran needs to do now in light of what has happened over the last 4 years, so that there can be a return to some form of an agreement whereby Iran will be required to adhere to these limitations and restrictions on their program so that they can benefit from some type of economic incentives that can be offered to them.
Do we, in fact, have to push out any sunset clauses? I mean, some of them end in 2025. That would be, what, 4 years from when the deal would be renegotiated?
Well, no one thought that the Iranian nuclear deal was a perfect deal, but frequently in negotiations, it's a series of compromises. And I think the Obama administration viewed the Iranian nuclear deal as a foundation upon which to build, not just in the nuclear realm, but also in the other areas, ballistic missile development, terrorism, other types of things. But tearing up the U.S. agreement and adherence to it, I think, has really set us back in terms of making progress on these very important fronts.
I think it's fair to say that the mutual contempt between you and Donald Trump is, I was trying to think of the right adjective yesterday, epic, profound. In fact, both of you have accused the other of treason, which raises the question, was it a mistake for you as the CIA director to come out so publicly and to attack a sitting president so sharply? And didn't you lend credence to President Trump's argument that there is a deep state in the intelligence community working against him?
Well, it's true. I'm a former senior intelligence official, but I have been a private citizen ever since I started to shoot back at Donald Trump because of his dishonesty, his deceit. And when he stood on the world stage in Helsinki and sided with Vladimir Putin against the U.S. intelligence community, yes, I did say that his actions were nothing short of treasonous. And so, yes, I have been strident in my criticism of him, but his irresponsibility on so many fronts, including on COVID, has angered me and has led me to speak out as vociferously as I have.
One of the things that President Trump has gone after you about and has accused you and other officials of is perpetuating what he calls the Russia hoax. Here he is.
You can look at Brennan and Comey and Clapper, the whole group. We caught him spying on our campaign. This was an illegal act like no other illegal act. This was treason. This was at the highest level of treason.
As I said, you both accused each other of treason. What do you think of Attorney General Barr extending the Durham investigation into the Obama administration, the FBI, the intelligence community, extending that investigation well into 2021?
Oh, I think that is fine. I have no problems with it. I do believe that John Durham is going to carry out his responsibilities ably and hopefully not with any type of political influence. I sat down for 8 hours with John Durham and his team answering all his questions. And so looking back at 2016, were there some mistakes made in terms of the FISA applications, other types of things? Yes, apparently there were. But that doesn't mean that there was criminal intent. And there was no spying on Donald Trump's campaign. And it's very clear from Robert Mueller's investigation that there were a lot of activities that I think were very unprincipled, unethical. And it'll be up to individuals in the future to determine whether or not there was any criminal activity that took place during that time.
But let me pick up on the Mueller investigation because it concluded in the long Mueller report that it did not find sufficient evidence that the Trump campaign either conspired or coordinated with the Russian government during the 2016 election. Do you accept that conclusion?
Well, yes, I do, that Bob Mueller was not able to establish that evidence of a criminal conspiracy. But it's clear from his report about the number of contacts that took place between the Trump campaign and Russians and Russian officials. And none of them were referred to the FBI. And so I think it is quite evident and clear that there was extensive interaction that should not have happened. And that is why the FBI was investigating, as it should have, the nature of those contacts and whether anybody was in fact conspiring with the Russians to try to affect the outcome of the 2016 election.
You talked about the FISA warrant to surveil Carter Page, and the Inspector General for the FBI said that that was improper. The lawyer who took actually some statements from the CIA and doctored them has pled guilty to a crime. What about what seems to be the pretty total discrediting of the Steele dossier?
Well, as we have said previously, the Steele dossier was not used in any way to undergird the judgments that came out of the intelligence community assessment about the Russian actions in the 2016 election. And so the Steele dossier was something that I never, looked at from a standpoint of credibility, because it wasn't something that the CIA had acquired. And so I think, people point to the Steele dossier as this, reason why the whole thing was a hoax. No, there was so much other evidence and intelligence to support those judgments. So I am very comfortable with how the intelligence community came out on that 2016 election.
And I got about 40 seconds here, so I'm going to need a quick answer, trying to find some point of agreement between you and President Trump. Do you give him credit for being more aggressive in taking on China?
I think it's important that we deal with China. It's not a one-dimensional issue. And I think the Biden administration is going to have to engage with the Chinese on all of the issues, whether it be trade, economics, cyber, North Korea, you name it, naval power in the South China Sea. But I do believe that it's important for us to have our eyes wide open when it comes to China, the threats that it poses, as well as possible cooperation.
Director Brennan, thank you. Thanks for coming in. Again, the name of the new book, Undaunted. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chris.